Welcome to Sign Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sign Facts, and step beyond the screen. Deepwater Horizon, a retelling and review. The men on board joked, laughed, and carried on like it was any other shift. For most of them, this was routine. They'd done it 100 times before, but a few of the newer crew members couldn't hide their awe at the sight of the massive rig. Seen from the air, the platform looked less like a piece of industrial equipment and more like a ship the size of a small city, anchored in the middle of the open ocean. To them, it was a genuine marvel of engineering. Before long, the helicopter set down safely on the helipad. Jimmy, the man in charge of the rig, stepped off and immediately sensed something was off. The logging crew was already packing up to leave. When Jimmy asked whether the well had been finished, they dodged the question, clearly uncomfortable, and their silence told him more than any answer could have. Unable to get a straight response, Jimmy and Mike went straight to the control room. Mike, the chief electrician, got to work running his usual checks. At first glance, everything seemed fine. Steady gauges, systems humming along, power flowing normally. Then he noticed something odd. A mud recovery vessel was parked nearby. That should have meant the early stage well work was already done. But there was a problem. Jimmy still hadn't received the cement test results. That missing report was a glaring red flag, hinting that a critical safety check had been skipped to keep things moving faster. Concerned, Mike headed to the main work area to ask the drillers what had happened. Every one of them gave the same answer: and a cement test had been run. It wasn't until Mike returned to the control room and pressed Jason that he got the real story. BP supervisors had paid the logging crew to leave the rig ahead of schedule. Mike relayed this to Jimmy, and the two of them went to confront the BP officials directly. On the walk over, Mike absent-mindedly flipped a coin into the CS small habitat and watched it vanish beneath the surface. Beneath that calm water, though, pressure was already building toward disaster. When they reached the BP supervisors, the tension was obvious. The rig, leased by BP, was running nearly 50 days behind schedule and had already cost the company more than $50 million. Desperate to make up lost time, they were willing to cut corners. Jimmy wasn't having it. BP might have been footing the bill, but he was the one responsible for every life on that platform, and no schedule or dollar figure was worth risking his crew. Because he held his ground, Vidrine reluctantly agreed to run another pressure test. The crew repositioned the platform and prepped the system. Jason sealed the subsea pipe by closing the annular preventer, and mud began surging rapidly through the lines below. Everyone's eyes were locked on the gauges during the negative pressure test. Vidrine looked visibly on edge. He knew a failed test could cost BP tens of millions more. They waited. The pressure reading settled around 100 pounds per square inch, a number that looked safe. For a moment, it seemed like the well had passed, but just as everyone started to relax, bubbles broke the surface near the seabed. The gauge suddenly spiked to nearly 500, then kept climbing a 450, 900 before blowing past every safe threshold to hit 1,395. The message was unmistakable. The pressure was far beyond acceptable limits. Vidrine refused to accept it. He argued the numbers didn't add up. If pressure inside the pipe were really that high, mud should have been flowing out of the drill pipe, but nothing was coming out. Neither Jimmy nor Mike had an easy explanation for that contradiction. Trying to defend his position, Vidrine sketched out a quick diagram, theorizing that the high pressure might be trapped in one isolated section near the sensor array, pressing against it directly and causing a false spike, while the rest of the pipe stayed stable. That, he argued, would explain the alarming reading despite no mud escaping. He proposed a second test, this time through the kill line connected to the drill pipe. insisting it would settle the matter once and for all. If the kill line showed the same pressure, the danger was real. If it read nothing, it was probably just a faulty sensor. It sounded plausible enough on the surface. Neither Jimmy nor Mike had a solid counter-argument in the moment. None of them could actually see what was happening thousands of feet below. All they had were gauges, numbers, and whatever the equipment was telling them. So even though something still felt wrong to Jimmy, he let Vidrine go ahead with the second test. Meanwhile, beneath the rig, conditions were turning violent. Mud, gas, and shattered rock were being forced upward with tremendous force. The kill line test initially showed pressure around 500 A, but then debris clogged part of the pipe, and the reading dropped instantly to 0. To Vidrine, that was exactly the result he'd been hoping for. It looked, to everyone watching, like his theory had been confirmed. No pressure on the kill line meant the earlier reading had been a fluke. What none of them realized was that the 0 reading wasn't proof of safety. It was a sign that something far more dangerous was unfolding inside the system. When Jimmy got word that the kill line pressure had dropped to 0, he still felt uneasy. Something didn't sit right, but with no evidence to contradict the numbers, he gave the go-ahead to continue. Jason reopened the annular preventer, and the trapped mud came rushing back up. Inside the control room, the crew began diverting the flow, pulling out the drilling mud that had been helping to balance the pressure. In doing so, they removed the last barrier protecting the rig. Within minutes, the pressure surged back into dangerous territory. Jason watched the reading climb past 230 and immediately shut down the mud transfer. As the crew scrambled to make sense of the erratic readings, Caleb, working outside, realized something had gone seriously wrong at the moment that ties directly back to the film's opening scene. From here, the situation escalated from a developing emergency into a full-blown catastrophe. For a brief moment, it looked like the blowout might be contained. Then the ocean floor unleashed an even more powerful surge. High-pressure rock and mud slammed through the system with such force that the annular preventer began tearing apart. The mud broke through the pipes and rushed into the diversion chamber. Nearby workers heard strange sounds from the valve area, turned to look, and an instant later, mud burst through the cracks. When Andrea saw the alarm go off, she assumed it was just another routine warning and didn't panic right away. When she tried to get confirmation, no one answered. Everyone near the equipment was already fighting to shut the valves. One of the older, more experienced hands immediately understood the severity of what was happening and started shouting for everyone to evacuate. This wasn't a minor malfunction, and the gauge climbing past 4,000 proved him right. Jason ordered the crew to close the second blowout preventer, but even that could only buy a little time against pressure that extreme. It couldn't stop the disaster outright. Mud blasted through the area again, throwing Caleb and others off their feet. In the brief opening they had, they scrambled clear and tried to escape. By now, the eruption below the seabed was in full force. Workers in the diversion chamber bore the brunt of the ocean surging up through the rig. Caleb wanted to help, but the violent mud flow made any rescue attempt impossible. Every time he tried to push forward, the current hit him like a solid wall, and chunks of rock were flying through the air like gunfire. Seeing how dangerous it had become, Jason ordered Caleb to get out immediately. Meanwhile, the nearby mud recovery vessel realized something had gone terribly wrong. Someone stepped onto the deck with binoculars to see what was happening, but before he could process the scene, an oil-soaked Pelican slammed into the wheelhouse. The sight left everyone aboard speechless. Back on the platform, the central work area had descended into total chaos, a mud tearing through equipment and destroying everything in its path. Jason shouted for the pipe to be cut, but before anyone could act, a powerful shockwave knocked him to the floor. Elsewhere, Mike was on a video call with his wife when the strange noise reached him, and he froze, trying to understand what he just heard. Vidrine, having barely survived the earlier blast, stood frozen in shock, clearly having no idea what to do next. The blowout was now carrying enormous quantities of crude oil, and oil vapors began pouring into the platform's intake vents. spreading through the internal pipelines and reaching the engines. That caused the thrusters to suddenly surge, pushing the entire platform out of position. But since the drill pipes still hadn't been severed, the rig remained physically tethered to the seabed. So as the platform shifted, the pipe bent, and the existing cracks widened further. The pressure escaping the system grew even more violent. Andrea saw the screens fill with error messages and alarms. She stepped out of the power room to check things for herself, and what she saw left her stunned. She rushed back in and called for help. The Coast Guard soon received the distress signal, confirmed via satellite imagery that something serious had happened on the platform, and the commander immediately began coordinating a rescue. There was one major obstacle. The rig sat far out at sea. Even a helicopter would need more than 30 minutes to arrive, and a firefighting vessel would take even longer. By this point, the entire platform was being consumed by fire. Nearby, the mud recovery vessel scrambled to gather whatever rescue equipment it had. Resources were limited, but there was no time to waste. Crew members launched lifeboats and headed toward the burning rig to start pulling survivors from the wreckage. Back on the platform, Jimmy, badly hurt and barely conscious, began to come to. His body was in rough shape, but he forced himself up, got dressed, and stumbled out into a scene unrecognizable from the rig he knew. Outside, he found Mike searching the wreckage for trapped workers. Mike had been struck by a door during the explosion but had escaped without life-threatening injuries. Jimmy asked to be taken to the control room. As the man in charge, he still had one critical job left: authorize the cut that would sever the drill pipe and separate the rig from the disaster unfolding beneath it. As Mike helped him move through the wrecked platform, they kept finding more trapped workers and stopped to free them, even as fresh explosions continued dripping through the rig. Blast after blast shook the steel structure until the platform finally lost power completely. Even so, they managed to get every trapped worker they found out alive. Meanwhile, Vidrine stood frozen, staring at the wreckage as though his mind had simply shut down. The platform looked like the end of the world, and he had no idea where to go or what to do. He eventually wandered into the control room, but no one there had answers either. They just exchanged silent, overwhelmed looks. At the lifeboat station, the first group of evacuees was preparing to leave, but a malfunctioning crane swung wildly overhead, slamming repeatedly into the metal structure. If it broke free, it would crush everyone in the lifeboat below. Seeing the danger, the crane operator made a courageous choice. He climbed into the cab, flames all around him, and fought to bring it back under control. The load was immense. The axle nearly seized, but he held on with everything he had. For a brief second, the workers below cheered, believing he'd saved them. Then, in the next moment, his fate was sealed. Elsewhere, Mike finally got Jimmy to the control room. When Jimmy realized Vidrine was there too, his fury boiled over. Even nearly blind, he confronted him directly, knowing full well that earlier decisions had helped lead them into this nightmare. After Vidrine left, someone guided Jimmy's hand to the pipe-cutting controls. He pressed the button, and two massive blades shot outward inside the drill pipe. But the cut failed. The others wanted to abandon the control room and evacuate, but Jimmy wouldn't give up. He believed they needed to restore power, since without it the platform would keep drifting and grow even more unstable. So Mike and Caleb ran through the burning wreckage toward the power room, sparks raining down around them, the air itself feeling like it had caught fire. A sudden fireball nearly ended their lives on the spot, but they made it inside. Following the emergency procedure step by step, Mike worked fast and managed to restore electricity. The lights flickered back on, systems came back online, and for a brief moment the platform's movement stabilized. But against a disaster this size, that small wind barely registered. Another explosion soon threw Mike and Caleb back into danger. When Jimmy and the others finally made it outside, they saw that the last lifeboat, already packed with survivors, had pulled away without them. Behind them, the rig kept exploding again and again. It was clear the structure wouldn't hold together much longer. Mike quickly gathered the remaining crew around an inflatable raft, telling everyone to board first while he stayed behind to make sure they got out safely. But before they could launch it, another blast threw Mike and Andrea across the deck. The worker managing the raft's release caught fire, panicked, and jumped into the ocean, sending the raft down to the water below without them. There was another terrifying problem. The sea around the rig was on fire. Jumping straight down into those flames would likely be fatal. Mike grabbed Andrea and pulled her toward higher ground, knowing their only real chance was to jump from a greater height, far enough to clear the flames and land somewhere safer. They made it to the helipad. Behind them, the Deepwater Horizon had become a towering inferno, as steel volcano roaring in the middle of the ocean, ready to swallow anything still standing on it. Mike tried to keep Andrea calm while helping her into a life jacket, but when she looked down, she froze in terror and couldn't bring herself to jump. There was no more time. Mike pushed her, then jumped in right after, plunging into the dark water below. He surfaced, searched until he found her, and moments later rescue boats pulled them both out. On the nearby mud recovery vessel, Jimmy began calling out names one by one, trying to account for every worker. Some answered. Some names were met with silence. Only after Mike and Andrea were brought aboard did the rescue helicopter finally arrive to airlift the most severely injured survivors away. By then, the drilling platform had been completely swallowed by fire. Later, Mike and the others were brought back to shore. They had survived, but the horror of what they'd witnessed stayed with them. And their bodies were safe, but their minds were still on that burning rig. When Mike's wife and daughter arrived at the hotel, simply being alive felt like a miracle. As his family walked into the lobby, Andrea stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug. Nearby, Caleb's family wore the same mix of relief, shock, and gratitude. At the entrance, Mike spotted Jimmy, wounded, exhausted, but alive, and his family embraced him one by one before finally saying their goodbyes. The film is based on true events. The Deepwater Horizon disaster claimed 11 lives. The well blew out for 87 days straight, spilling roughly 210 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, still the worst oil spill in U.S. history. A closer look at the film. When people think of Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill usually comes to mind first, and that's understandable. The footage was everywhere: fire on the water, black crude spreading across the Gulf, oil-soaked wildlife, BP dragged through headline after headline, and a pervasive sense that something had broken on a scale no one could easily fix. But Peter Berg's film takes a different approach. It doesn't open as a sweeping environmental documentary, and it skips the charts, the lawsuits, the political debate, the full accounting of the aftermath. Instead, it zooms in, bringing us back to April 2010, onto the rig itself, to show what happened before this became a national headline. That's what makes the film compelling right out of the gate. For most people, the Deepwater Horizon tragedy lives in memory as an environmental catastrophe. But this film reminds us that before it became that, it was a workplace disaster. Real men and women were on that rig, people doing their jobs, calling home, joking with co-workers, trusting that the machinery around them, and the decisions made above them, wouldn't put their lives at risk. That trust, of course, was broken. The story unfolds in the Gulf of Mexico, where the rig is carrying out a deep-water drilling job for BP. At first, everything feels almost mundane. As the crew arrives, conversations happen. People settle back into the rhythm of work, but underneath it all is a quiet unease. The film doesn't shout it, but it makes sure you feel it. And that's where the tension comes from. We already know how this ends, and the film knows we know it too. So every small warning sign carries extra weight. Every rushed decision feels sharper. Every dismissed safety concern lands with an uncomfortable heaviness. Because we're watching people walk toward a disaster history has already recorded. That's the film's strongest hook. It's not really asking what happened, but asking us to sit with the dread of watching a preventable disaster unfold in real time. Long before the explosions, before the fire, before the rig becomes a nightmare of mud and smoke and twisted metal, the film already has a pulse. The real horror isn't just that something went wrong, it's that people saw the warning signs, and the operation kept moving anyway. Setup and premise on paper, the setup is simple, but what's underneath it is anything but. We're on an offshore rig in the Gulf, already running behind schedule, and the detail matters, because from the start the film makes clear that time isn't just time here. Time is money. Every delay costs someone something, and once a company starts viewing safety through the lens of cost, things start feeling dangerous long before anything actually explodes. The crew arrives like it's just another rotation. Mike Williams comes aboard. Jimmy Harrell carries that old-school supervisor energy, the kind of guy who doesn't need to raise his voice to make an impression, because he knows this place better than anyone in the room. Workers settle into their usual rhythm, talking, joking, checking equipment, moving through routine. It feels like a real job site rather than a polished Hollywood version of one. But friction shows up fast. A safety team leaves before finishing its checks. The pressure tests don't feel right. The numbers don't sit well with the people who actually have to work on the rig. And then there are the BP representatives, a Donald Vedrine chief among them, pushing forward with a quiet corporate confidence that sounds reasonable right up until you realize exactly what it's risking. That's the core premise. A group of workers senses something's wrong, but the people controlling the schedule want the operation to keep moving. The film doesn't play this as a mystery. We're never wondering if the rig will be fine. We already know what's coming. The tension comes from watching the steps that lead there, the ignored warnings, the arguments over test results, the small decisions that don't look catastrophic on their own but pile up into something awful. For much of its first half, Deepwater Horizon isn't really an explosion movie yet. It's a pressure movie, literally and dramatically. Pressure under the ocean floor, pressure inside the equipment, pressure from management, pressure on workers who understand that one wrong call out there doesn't just ruin a workday, it can mean people don't go home. Once the disaster finally breaks loose, the film shifts from workplace tension into full survival chaos. Fire, mud, smoke, alarms, twisted metal, people desperately searching for a way out. That second half works because the groundwork has already been laid, and this wasn't a random accident. It was a job where the warning signs were there, safety was questioned, and the drive to keep moving mattered more than stopping to ask whether they were about to make a terrible mistake. The weight of a true story. One of the first things that hits you about Deepwater Horizon is that this isn't some disaster dreamed up by a screenwriter. You already know it happened. You remember the news footage, the headlines about millions of gallons of spilled oil, the blackened water, the lives lost. Berg leans into that immediately. He doesn't need to explain why any of it matters, because the audience already carries that weight, and it changes how you watch the film. There's no mystery here. You're never wondering if something bad will happen. You know it will. The tension comes from watching how it happens, from watching these men and women go about their jobs, doing everything they can, while the disaster creeps closer with every skipped test and rushed decision. That grounding in real events gives the film an almost unavoidable emotional pull. Every joke, every small interaction, every routine task on the rig carries a shadow, because once you know the outcome, even a casual glance at a gauge feels loaded with dread. It's also part of what makes the film feel real in a way pure fiction can't. The explosions and the chaos aren't just spectacle. They're grounded in something that actually happened, and knowing that real people lived through it, or didn't, gives every frame an edge that's hard to fake. You could argue this limits the film in some ways, since knowing the ending strips away the what-if tension a fictional disaster might offer. But that's also part of the power of using a real event. The dread never lets up. You're waiting for the inevitable, and because it really happened, every second of build-up feels like a tightrope walk over a drop you already know is coming. Mike Williams, the audience's anchor. If there's one character the film leans on most to guide us through the chaos, it's Mike Williams, played by Mark Wahlberg, and that makes sense, since he's the person whose eyes we share, carrying us from the slow-building tension into the inferno. Mike isn't a larger-than-life action hero. He doesn't get big speeches or dramatic proclamations. He's the chief electronics technician, a guy who knows the machinery, understands the rig, and cares about the people around him. He's practical, capable, and, crucially, human. You can see the stress in his face, the worry for his coworkers, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him as he tries to do a normal job in a deeply abnormal situation. Berg does something smart by showing us Mike in two worlds. On shore, he has a wife and daughter waiting, which makes every risk on the rig feel personal. On the platform, he's part of a team, and we watch him move through routines, read gauges, spot problems, and quietly push back against bad calls, giving us a real sense of what it's like to be caught between instinct and corporate pressure. That said, the film does lean heavily on Mike. By the second half, once everything's falling apart, he's front and center for most of the survival story. That works fine as a narrative anchor, but it flattens some of the other crew members. We care about Mike, as we should, but at times the rest of the rig's workers fade into background noise while he becomes the film's emotional center of gravity. Still, Wahlberg does solid work here. There's sincerity in the performance, and he brings a grounded normalcy that keeps you invested without ever tipping into an exaggerated hero routine. He's just a man caught in a nightmare, doing what he can to survive and help others, and that's enough to make the film hit harder. Having a clear central viewpoint matters in a movie like this. Without it, the chaos could feel distant and abstract. With Mike as the anchor, you're not just watching explosions on a rig, you're watching someone live through them, and his fear, determination, and occasional helplessness give the story its human pulse. Setting the stage at home before the film ever gets to the rig, it spends some time with Mike at home, and yes, on one level, you can feel it hitting familiar disaster movie beats. The husband, the wife, the daughter, the ordinary morning before everything goes sideways. It's not a new trick, but it's not useless either. Kate Hudson plays Felicia, Mike's wife, and those early scenes remind us these workers had lives beyond the rig. Homes, routines, small conversations before a shift, people waiting for a call back. That grounds the story on a human scale. Mike isn't just a technician walking into danger, he's a father leaving his daughter behind for another shift, a husband saying goodbye like it's any other day. And that's what quietly stings, because for him, it is just another day. He doesn't walk out like a man heading into history, he walks out like someone going to work. That detail matters later, when the disaster hits and we're reminded there are people on shore who have no way to help, no way to reach him. They can only wait. And that waiting adds its own kind of pressure to the story. Sure, the wife and child setup is familiar disaster movie shorthand, and you can sense the film placing those pieces exactly where you'd expect, setting up an emotional payoff later. But even if it's a familiar move, it works because the situation is real. These weren't invented action heroes with invented families, they were workers with actual lives outside the rig. The family scenes may be conventional, but they bring the tragedy back down to a human scale. One living room, one goodbye, one family waiting for news. In a film full of fire, mud, and corporate blame, that reminder matters. Everyone on that rig had a life outside the frame. Jimmy Harrell, the quiet conscience. Then there's Jimmy Harrell, played by Kurt Russell, and he's the one who really keeps the film grounded. Jimmy isn't flashy, he doesn't make speeches or chase the spotlight. He's the experienced, cautious supervisor who's seen enough rigs and enough small mistakes to know when the problem is about to become a catastrophe. From the moment he steps aboard, it's clear he's paying attention not just to the gauges but to the people around him. The skipped steps, the rushed calls, and he's not afraid to push back. Russell carries that authority effortlessly, without needing to raise his voice. There's a quiet command to him that makes you trust his judgment even before disaster strikes, and you understand exactly why the crew listens to him even as management keeps pressing forward. Jimmy represents caution in a world obsessed with speed and profit. He's the embodiment of something's wrong here, and the film leans on that to build tension. Every glance at a gauge, every hesitant check, every raised eyebrow at a BP rep adds to that creeping sense of doom. And it works because Russell makes him feel entirely real. He's not perfect, not a superhero, just practical, knowledgeable, and concerned. And when disaster finally strikes, It's that same experience and attentiveness that lets him survive and help others. Jimmy is the film's quiet conscience, the person you believe when he says stop. This isn't safe. In a movie full of explosions and corporate negligence, that kind of steady presence is essential. He's the anchor amid all the fire and smoke, a reminder that knowing what's right isn't always enough to stop the consequences. Donald V. Dreen, corporate logic with a face. And then there's Donald V. Dreen, played by John Malkovich, essentially the human face of BP's corporate pressure. V. Dreen is one of those characters who immediately puts you on edge. He's calm, polite even, but you can feel the priority shifting underneath every word. Deadlines, schedules, money, safety, for him, is a suggestion at best, and Berg doesn't play that subtly. Every time V. Dreen appears, you sense the rig's well-being is secondary to the spreadsheet. Malkovich doesn't play him as a villain barking orders. He's smarter than that. He's the type who rationalizes shortcuts and convinces himself the risk is manageable. Sure, it might be dangerous, but it's cheaper this way. And it'll probably be fine. The tension comes from knowing he's wrong, and the workers know it too, but he doesn't. That's what makes the character work. He's not a cartoon villain, he's corporate logic given a human face, a polite, calm, strategic, and unnervingly confident. As the film unfolds, cracks start to show, and once the rig explodes, that confidence evaporates completely. Suddenly he's just another person caught in consequences he thought he could control. V. Dreen and BP's leadership are the reason the tension exists in the first place, at the push against a safety-conscious crew. The people who dismiss concerns and prioritize the bottom line over lives. The film makes that abundantly clear, maybe too clear at times, but it works. It gives you someone to be frustrated with, and it drives the entire build-up to disaster. In a story about a preventable catastrophe, V. Dreen embodies exactly that preventability at the corporate edge that cuts through caution and ultimately lights the fuse. Malkovich sells it perfectly, calm and almost charming, right up until you realize how dangerous that calm really is. A story about decisions, not just disaster. The real engine of Deepwater Horizon isn't the explosion, it's the decision-making that leads to it. That's what makes the film uncomfortable well before the rig catches fire. The danger doesn't come out of nowhere, it builds through layers of pressure, a corporate, financial, schedule-driven, slowly pushing safety into a corner. As the film presents it, BP isn't just impatient, it's careless in a polished, corporate way where nobody explicitly says let's risk lives, but the conversation somehow keeps landing there anyway. Tests get questioned, warning signs get brushed off, delays get treated like personal insults to the budget, and the men who'd actually have to live with the consequences are the ones being told to keep moving. That's the uncomfortable thread the film keeps circling back to. When money becomes the loudest voice in the room, safety starts to sound like an inconvenience, and that hits hard, because this isn't framed as some freak accident where nature simply turned violent. The film wants you to feel this could have been avoided. It wants you angry at the shortcuts, the arrogance, the way human lives got quietly weighed against lost time and rising costs. It's not subtle about it, but maybe it doesn't need to be, as some disasters don't require poetic interpretation. Sometimes the point really is that people knew better and pushed forward anyway. What's especially frustrating is how ordinary the negligence feels. It's not one dramatic, evil decision, it's smaller and, in some ways, more believable than that. A skip check here, a rushed conversation there, a test result explained away because accepting it would mean stopping the job. That's how the film portrays corporate greed, not as a grand speech, but as a series of small, practical-sounding choices that add up to something deadly. By the time everything goes wrong, the anger is already there, the fire is horrifying, the explosions are terrifying, but what stays with you is the knowledge that this wasn't bad luck, it was the result of people treating caution like a line item, a clear moral line. One thing that stands out about Deepwater Horizon is how sharply it draws the line between good and bad. It's not subtle. The rig workers are the good guys, practical, hard-working, conscientious, human and flawed but fundamentally decent. BP, represented by people like V. Dreen, is the opposite. Calculating, calm, money-driven, dismissive of safety. The film makes it obvious who you're meant to root for. You could argue that's a bit simplistic. Real disasters are rarely this neat, and responsibility usually spreads across systems, protocols, training, and plain bad luck. But Berg doesn't complicate the moral picture here. You know instantly who to root for and who to be frustrated with, and that works in its own way, because by the time the explosion hits, you are already invested in the crew. You've watched the dismissals, the skipped tests, the tension between experience and corporate greed pile up, so when things fall apart, it lands hard, both emotionally and morally. You feel the injustice of it. The film may simplify things, but it's also honest. It's trying to show that some disasters aren't just tragic accidents, they're preventable, and preventable disasters have faces you can recognize. That moral clarity gives the audience a reason to care beyond the spectacle. This isn't trying to be a nuanced corporate thriller. It's trying to make you feel the weight of greed, the pressure of shortcuts, and the cost of ignored warnings, and in that, it succeeds. The technical density, a double-edged sword. One of the trickiest parts of Deepwater Horizon is how thoroughly it tries to show you what it's like to actually work on a deepwater rig, and that world is genuinely complicated. Pressure tests, cement integrity checks, sensors, gauges, marine risers, blowout preventers, drilling mud, methane gas, and the list goes on. Even for someone with a passing familiarity with rig operations, it's a lot to absorb, and for the average viewer it can feel like everyone around you is nodding along to a foreign language. Berg does try to help. There's a small visual explanation using a sodacan to illustrate pressure, and watching the crew walk through procedures gives a sense of real people doing real, high-stakes technical work. But even with that, it can get confusing. There are moments where it's not entirely clear why opening the well was a problem, or why one reading causes alarm while another doesn't. That's partly the point. The danger is invisible until it isn't. But it does make the first half feel dense at times. Still, there's something immersive about seeing it all laid out. Even without catching every technical detail, you feel the weight of the machinery, the precision required, the tightrope being walked, and it all builds that growing sense of dread. Once the disaster begins, all the setup pays off, and you understand how small mistakes and ignored warnings snowball into full-blown catastrophe. The technical material isn't just background noise, it's the ticking clock, the hidden threat that makes the explosion feel terrifyingly plausible rather than just dramatic. There's another way to look at this confusion, though. Maybe we're not meant to fully understand every technical detail. Even when the exact mechanics go over your head, you understand the mood, and you understand something is wrong, that the workers are worried, that the people who should be slowing things down are instead being pushed to keep going. In a strange way, that confusion puts you in the position of someone standing near a machine they don't fully understand but can tell is making the wrong sound. You don't need to know every internal piece to feel the danger. You just need to see the crew's faces, hear the hesitation in their voices, notice how the room shifts when a test result doesn't sit right. That's where the film finds a strange kind of realism. A deepwater rig isn't a simple place, and it's not supposed to feel easy. It's a massive, dangerous, technical environment where a misread number can mean life or death. So when the film makes you feel a little lost, that confusion actually adds to the tension. You're not calmly observing from above. You're inside the uncertainty. That's not to say the exposition is always handled gracefully. A clearer line here or there would have helped, and sometimes the jargon feels less like realism and more like the film hoping we'll simply accept that smart people are worried. But the emotional clarity is always there. You may not walk away able to pass an oil drilling exam, but you understand enough to feel the pressure rising, and that's what the drama actually needs. This isn't a monster movie. It's about sitting in the uncomfortable space where danger is building, the experts are uneasy, and the people in power keep acting like everything's under control. A deliberate, sometimes slow build. The first half of Deepwater Horizon is essentially the film tightening a bolt one turn at a time. It doesn't race toward the explosion, and that patience matters. Before the rig becomes fire and smoke, The film wants us to sit in the ordinary rhythm of the place. Workers arrive, people joke around, equipment gets checked, conversations drift between the personal and the technical, mixed with the kind of workplace grumbling that feels familiar even if you've never set foot on a rig. At first, nothing looks especially dramatic, and that's precisely what makes it unsettling. The tension builds in small increments, a safety team leaving early, certain tests left undone, Jimmy Harrell not liking what he's hearing, the BP men treating delays like the real emergency. Even without panic, the crew seems to sense that something is off. That slow build creates the film's first layer of dread. You're watching people go through the motions of a normal workday, but because you already know the history, every small warning sign feels louder than it should. A pressure reading isn't just a pressure reading. A tense meeting isn't just workplace friction. A skipped procedure isn't just a shortcut. It's another step toward disaster. What works well here is that it lets the rig feel alive before it becomes a nightmare. You get a sense of a real place with routines, hierarchy, friendships, and frustrations. That matters, because if the film opened straight into chaos, the destruction would be loud but not personal. The build-up gives the disaster something to actually destroy. Is it always gripping? Not entirely. There are stretches where the technical dialogue gets heavy and lingers longer than it needs to, but the atmosphere holds. The dread quietly grows underneath, and that's the key. The first half isn't about spectacle. It's about pressure. Pressure in the well, pressure from BP, pressure on the crew, pressure on the audience, all building toward the moment when the ignored warnings finally become something nobody can control. By the time the rig erupts, the film has already done the important work. The explosion feels less like a random disaster sequence and more like the terrible consequence of everything we just watched get dismissed. Pacing, a trade-off worth making. The pacing of that first half is a little tricky. The film spends a long time on setup. The crew, the routines, the banter, the equipment checks, the friction between management and workers. It's understandable. Berg wants you to care before disaster strikes, to know these people and understand why every skipped test matters. But for some viewers, it will drag. It's talky and procedural at points, and there are moments where you're simply waiting for something to happen, and you are, in fact, waiting. Some of the early technical dialogue is heavy-handed, and not every character introduced sticks in your memory. So once chaos erupts, it can be hard to keep track of who's who. Still, the slow pacing does build genuine tension if you let it. Every skipped step, every dismissed concern, every uneasy glance at a gauge quietly stacks onto that sense of impending doom. You might roll your eyes a bit at the exposition-heavy stretches, but by the time the explosion hits, all the time in normal pays off. You feel the loss, the danger, the frustration, the why didn't anyone listen energy that follows. So yes, the first half can feel slow and dense, but it's necessary. It's the pressure cooker portion of the story, where the stakes get quietly explained and your connection to the crew gets forged. Without it, the second half might feel like random fire and chaos rather than a catastrophe that could have been prevented. Life on the rig before the disaster. One of the things the film does especially well is show life on the rig before everything falls apart. It's not just a workplace. It's almost a small floating community. You see the crew joking, teasing each other, arguing over minor things, moving through their daily routines, knowing each other's habits and quirks. That camaraderie makes the crew feel genuinely real. You believe these are people who've spent long stretches together in tight quarters, and that makes the disaster that much more devastating. Small touches. Someone making coffee, the way people handle equipment, how they call out to each other on deck add layers of authenticity. It's easy to forget, in a disaster film built around machinery and corporate decisions, that before the chaos there's an ordinary, lived-in rhythm to the place. Berg captures that well. You can imagine these workers doing the same job week after week. That's why, when the explosion hits, it's not just the destruction of metal and fire. It's the rupture of a small, functioning community you've already come to know. You've seen them joke, look out for one another, handle danger day to day. So when the alarms go off and smoke fills the rig, The weight of it lands. You know who's at risk. And it makes the panic, the bravery, and the loss hit harder. It also helps that these moments of camaraderie aren't overly sentimental. The film doesn't pause to lecture you about team spirit, it just shows it, and the contrast with the disaster that follows is devastating. The cast beyond the leads. Here's the thing about Deepwater Horizon, the main characters land solidly, but a good chunk of the supporting cast ends up thinner than you'd like. Mark Wahlberg as Mike Williams and Kurt Russell as Jimmy Harrell are both easy to connect with. You understand their concerns, feel their worry and determination, and they carry the emotional weight of the story. The rest of the crew is harder to keep straight. Gina Rodriguez, Dylan O'Brien, Stella Allen, and others move in and out of the narrative, and while there's a real effort to make them feel like actual people through banter and small tasks, once the disaster hits it's easy to lose track of who's who. Faces get covered in soot, mud, and flame, and individuality fades. That's not to say these characters don't matter. Their presence adds realism and gives the sense of a fully staffed rig, but the film doesn't always give them arcs or standout moments to make them individually memorable. You care about the group as a whole, and deeply about Mike and Jimmy specifically, but the rest often become shapes moving through fire. It's a trade-off. Giving every crew member a full arc would have slowed down the intensity Berg is going for, but it does mean the human tragedy, while powerful, can feel concentrated on just a few people rather than the dozens who were actually involved. Even with that limitation, though, you still feel the danger and the stakes. The thinness of some roles doesn't sink the film, but it's noticeable if you are looking for deeper character work beyond the two leads. Familiar archetypes, used deliberately. There's no getting around the fact that Deepwater Horizon leans on a lot of familiar disaster movie building blocks. The ordinary working man at the center, the seasoned veteran who senses trouble, the corporate figure who keeps pushing because money talks louder than common sense, the wife and child waiting at home, the hard-working crew, and eventually the big catastrophic moment where every ignored warning turns into fire. It's all recognizable, and depending on your view, that's either a weakness or part of why the film works. Some of these characters do feel like types. Mike Williams as the dependable blue-collar hero, Jimmy Harrell as the old-school safety conscience, Donald Vedrine as the money-first executive, Felicia as the worried wife back home. None of these are especially fresh dramatic roles, and you can see the film placing them on the board early, but disaster films often need that kind of clarity. When smoke fills the screen and people are running through fire, audiences need emotional shortcuts: who to trust, who to be angry at, who to fear for. Deepwater Horizon leans into that, maybe a little too readily. The complication is that because this is based on real events, those archetypes carry extra weight. These weren't fictional characters built to fit a formula. They were real people, or based directly on them, caught in a real disaster. So when the film settles into a hero worker versus greedy corporate man structure, it becomes effective but also slightly uncomfortable, since real life is usually messier and real people more complicated than the roles a disaster film hands them. Even so, the archetypes do their job. They make the story easy to enter, giving the audience a clear emotional path through a technically dense event. You may not fully understand every pressure reading or drilling term, but you understand a supervisor saying this isn't safe, a company man pushing forward anyway, and a father trying to survive and get home. That's why the formula doesn't fully hurt the film. It simplifies the people, sure, but it also gives the disaster a human shape, and once the rig erupts, those familiar roles become anchors inside the chaos. It's not subtle, but in the middle of fire, mud, and panic, subtlety was never really the goal. Mark Wahlberg's grounded performance. Wahlberg's performance is interesting because it doesn't really ask him to transform, and that's not a knock. He's playing Mike Williams as a grounded, practical blue-collar guy. Not poetic, not loaded with big dramatic speeches, not the kind of performance that's clearly angling for awards attention. Mike is simply a man who knows his job, loves his family, and walks into a workday that slowly turns into a nightmare. That role fits Wahlberg naturally. He has that straightforward screen presence that makes you believe he can fix something, climb through wreckage, and shout over machinery while still feeling like a regular person rather than a polished action hero. There's simplicity to the performance, but it works for the film. Mike isn't meant to be mysterious or larger than life. He's the audience's anchor, the person we follow through the technical messiness and overwhelming disaster. In the quieter scenes, Wahlberg gives Mike enough warmth to make the family material land. He feels like a husband and father trying to keep life normal before another dangerous shift. Nothing overplayed, just enough. He's most effective once the rig starts falling apart. Wahlberg is good at playing controlled panic, and you see the fear, but you also see the training kicking in. Mike doesn't magically become a superhero untouched by terror. He looks scared, exhausted, shaken, but keeps moving because there are people who need help and no time to stop. The film does push him a bit too far into hero territory at times. That can feel like the entire disaster is being shaped around Mike's survival arc, when this was obviously a much wider tragedy involving many workers. That's more of a script issue than a performance issue, but it affects how the character reads. The film wants him to be the emotional center so badly that some of the ensemble fades into the background around him. Still, Wahlberg holds that center well. It's not the flashiest performance in the film. Russell brings more authority, Malkovich is more memorable, but Wahlberg gives Deepwater Horizon exactly what it needs, a steady, human viewpoint inside all the noise, fire, and confusion. He won't surprise you, but he keeps you watching. Kurt Russell's quiet authority. Kurt Russell is one of the best things about this film, and not because he's doing anything loud. That's actually why he works. As Jimmy Harrell, or Mr. Jimmy as the crew calls him, Russell brings a heavy, lived-in authority to the role. He feels like a man who's spent years around dangerous machinery, difficult crews, and corporate people who think they understand the job better than the people actually doing it. You believe he knows this rig. You believe he recognizes the warning signs, and most importantly, you believe the crew trusts him. There's a calm to Russell's performance that does a lot of heavy lifting. He never over-explains Jimmy's experience. It's in the way he enters a room, the way he listens, the way his expression shifts when something feels wrong. He has that old-school screen presence where a single look tells you this is serious. That matters, because Jimmy is essentially the film's safety conscience, the person asking the questions that should have been asked, pushing back against the shortcuts, sensing that the pressure readings, missing tests, and BP's impatience are all pointing towards something ugly. When he pushes back, the tension sharpens because Russell makes that concern feel earned rather than paranoid. There's also a quiet, tragic irony to him. The film frames him as the embodiment of caution and responsibility right before the whole system collapses around him, and yet even that isn't enough once the wrong decisions have already been made above him. Once the explosion hits, Russell doesn't turn Jimmy into an action figure. He lets him feel hurt, overwhelmed, shaken, and that vulnerability matters. It reminds us that even the most experienced person on that rig is still just a human being caught inside something uncontrollable. For me, Russell gives the film its backbone. Wahlberg may be the central viewpoint, and Malkovich the most colorful presence, but Russell is the one who makes the danger feel credible before it ever becomes visible. And in a film this loud, that quiet weight carries a lot. John Malkovich's unsettling calm. John Malkovich is easily one of the most memorable elements of the film, not because Vidrine is likable, because he really isn't. He's essentially the face of BP's pressure on the rig, standing there with corporate confidence while the workers try to explain that something feels wrong. He's calm, controlled, and frustrating in that specific way where a person sounds entirely reasonable while making genuinely dangerous choices, and Malkovich knows exactly how to play that. He doesn't turn Vidrine into a cartoon villain, which would have been the easy route, a louder, nastier, more obviously bad. Instead, he gives him a quiet arrogance, measured words, deliberate pacing, the almost slippery confidence of someone who's spent years justifying bad decisions with professional-sounding language. That's what makes him irritating in exactly the right way. You can see him thinking purely in numbers, time lost, money wasted, schedule pressure. From his point of view, every delay is a problem to be managed rather than a warning to respect. He doesn't see danger the way the crew does, and they see risk because they physically have to stand inside it, while Vidrine sees inconvenience. Malkovich makes that disconnect feel real. There's also something quietly pathetic about him as the film progresses. Early on, he holds all the confidence in the room, pushing, questioning, dismissing, explaining away concerns. But once the fire takes over, all that corporate certainty means nothing, and suddenly he's just another man surrounded by consequences he can't control. That's where the performance outpaces the writing around it. The film clearly wants Vidrine to be the villain, and he is, but Malkovich gives him enough texture that he never feels like a symbol with a name tag. He's slimy, money-minded, and dangerously dismissive, but also feels trapped inside the logic of the company he represents, a logic where shaving time off the job matters more than listening to the people who actually understand the rig. Because Malkovich plays him with such controlled confidence, every scene involving him carries tension without needing shouting or threats. The danger is in how calm he is, and that calm is exactly what makes him unsettling. Because in this story, disaster doesn't begin with fire. It begins with people convincing themselves the warning signs can be ignored. The wider crew, the supporting cast, has a genuinely difficult job here. They're not given big, polished arcs. This isn't a film where every crew member gets a backstory or a defining speech. Most are introduced through workplace rhythm, quick conversations, small jokes, tension on the rig, people simply doing their jobs. That approach fits the kind of film this is. Gina Rodriguez is one of the stronger supporting presences, bringing real pressure to the bridge scenes once everything starts collapsing and fast decisions have to be made. You can feel her trying to stay professional as the situation spirals, and that mix of fear and discipline works well. Kate Hudson, as Mike's wife, plays a more familiar role. Alice bounce back home slowly realizing something terrible might be happening offshore. It's not the most original part, but she brings sincerity to it, and her scenes matter because they remind us the disaster doesn't only exist on the rig. Everyone out there has someone on land who might be waiting for a call that never comes. Dylan O'Brien and the rest of the crew help fill out the working environment, making the rig feel populated and alive, even if the film doesn't give each of them enough space to become fully memorable individually. This is where the film runs into some trouble, though. Once the explosion hits, the supporting characters become hard to track. Faces are covered in mud and soot, everyone's running through smoke, and the editing keeps cutting between different parts of the rig. So even when you care about the crew collectively, you might not always know exactly who's hurt, who's missing, or who's simply vanished into the chaos. In a strange way, that adds a certain realism. In a disaster like this, people aren't always processed as clean, individual storylines. Sometimes they're just voices in the smoke, figures moving through fire, co-workers calling out in panic. That collective quality gives the film its sense of community, and the supporting cast may not all get full dramatic weight, but they make Deepwater Horizon feel like a genuine workplace before it becomes a disaster site. And that groundwork matters more than it first appears. Once everything goes wrong, when the disaster hits, when the explosion finally happens, the entire temperature of the film changes. Up to that point, it's been pressure, suspicion, warnings, arguments, and technical talk. Something is clearly building, but it's still largely contained within conversations and machinery. Then the blowout hits, and the film stops being about what might happen and becomes entirely about survival. This is where the movie is at its most gripping. The disaster doesn't feel clean or choreographed. It's ugly. Mud blasts through the rig, gas spreads, fire erupts, metal tears apart, alarms scream, and people are thrown into walls and covered in oil and debris, struggling to understand what just happened before the next thing goes wrong. There's no comfortable pause to breathe and process. It just keeps coming. What makes the sequence work is how physical it feels. The rig doesn't explode like a weightless CGI toy. It feels massive, heavy, industrial. Every blast carries real force. Every burst of flame threatens to swallow the frame whole. The mud, Smoke, heat, and sparks combine to create the horrifying sense that the environment itself has turned against the people trapped inside it. Because the film spent real time establishing the rig as an actual workplace, the destruction lands harder, as this isn't just metal being torn apart, it's a place where people were talking, joking, and checking gauges only moments before. The second half is essentially one long descent into chaos. Workers get separated, some are injured, some try to help others, some are simply trying to find any way off the rig before it becomes impossible. The film leans hard into the confusion, and you feel how quickly control disappears. One bad decision becomes mechanical failure becomes an explosion, and the explosion becomes a firestorm, until everyone is reduced to pure instinct. That's the terrifying part of the sequence. No matter how experienced these people are or how well they know the rig, once the disaster fully opens up, they're all just human beings inside something far bigger than themselves. There are stretches where the spectacle nearly becomes overwhelming. The fire, the noise, the running, the debris pushing right up to the edge of exhaustion. But most of the time that intensity works, because the event itself should feel unbearably too loud, too hot, too fast. In those minutes, Deepwater Horizon becomes exactly what it needs to be, not just a movie about an explosion, but a movie about the instant when warnings turn into consequences. The sequence is frightening because it feels inevitable, and once it starts, there's no clean way out. Immersive, uncompromising action. The action here isn't the clean, fun kind. It's not a movie where you sit back and enjoy an expensive-looking set piece. It's uglier and heavier than that. Once the rig goes up, the film drops you right into the middle of it. Fire everywhere, mud everywhere, alarms screaming, metal breaking apart, people running and slipping and coughing through smoke, trying to find anyone they can still help. For a stretch, the film barely lets you breathe. That's where Peter Berg's directing style really pays off. He doesn't frame the disaster like a tidy action sequence. He makes it feel messy and panicked. You're not observing the rig from a safe distance. You're in the corridors, on the deck, near the flames, in the dark, alongside people who don't fully understand what's happening yet. There's a constant sense of where do you even go, since every escape route seems dangerous and something else is collapsing, exploding, or catching fire every few seconds. The immersion is intense and you can almost feel the heat coming off the screen, and the sound design does a lot of that work. The blasts, the alarms, the groaning metal, the roar of fire in the background. It turns the disaster into something physical, something that presses down on you rather than something you simply watch. That matters because the movie is dealing with a real tragedy. The action can't just be cool, it has to feel frightening and wrong. A constant reminder that these aren't superhero moments but workers trapped in a nightmare that never should have happened. There are times when the chaos becomes almost too much. The camera shakes, the editing moves fast, faces are covered in mud and soot, and you can lose track of who's where. But even that confusion feeds the panic in its own way, making the rig feel like an uncontrollable, ever-shifting maze. For all its flaws, this is where Deepwater Horizon truly earns its impact. It doesn't just show you destruction, it traps you inside it. When chaos becomes hard to follow, one genuine issue with the film, especially once the disaster kicks into high gear, is that the chaos can become difficult to read. That's understandable. A real-life rig explosion in the middle of the ocean wouldn't be neat or clearly blocked like a typical action scene where every character gets a clean hero shot. It would be dark, loud, messy, and terrifying, with everyone covered in mud, smoke, oil, and soot, and no clear sense of what's happening in every corner of the platform. The film captures that almost too well. Once the blowout hits, characters move through smoke-filled spaces, fire-lit corridors, broken metal, and debris, faces dirty, voices shouted over noise, the camera constantly moving, the editing jumping between different groups and moments of danger. After a while, you might find yourself wondering who that was, where they are now, or whether they made it out. That confusion does create a certain realism. It puts you inside the panic, the disorientation, the sense that the rig has become a burning maze. In those moments, the film isn't just showing chaos, it's making you experience it. But there's a downside: when you can't always tell who's injured, who's missing, or where everyone is relative to the danger, some of the emotional impact gets blurred. You care about the crew as a whole, absolutely, but individual moments can lose their sharpness when the story is moving this fast and everyone's covered in the same layer of smoke and grime. It's a difficult balance. Too much clarity and a disaster risks feeling staged. Too much confusion and the audience starts fighting the film just to understand what it's looking at. Deepwater Horizon lands somewhere in the middle but definitely leans toward immersion over clarity, and most of the time that works because the terror feels immediate. You're not watching from above with a perfect map of the rig, you're down there with them, making sense of the disaster 1 second at a time. Still, a few cleaner moments would have helped, not to soften the disaster, but to give the human stakes a bit more precision. When the film slows down enough to let us recognize who's in danger, it becomes far more powerful. When it doesn't, the fire stays frightening, but the people inside it start to blur together. Peter Berg's direction here is very much Peter Berg doing what Peter Berg does, dropping you into the middle of a crisis and making you feel it before you've had time to fully process it. There's a roughness to his style, shaky camera work, fast cutting, bodies moving through smoke, people shouting over machinery, the whole frame constantly vibrating with pressure. It's not elegant filmmaking, exactly, but it's effective, and for this particular story, that matters. Berg clearly understands the physical dimension of the disaster. He knows how to make the rig feel huge, dangerous, and alive before it starts coming apart. In the first half, he lets tension build through small details, uncomfortable conversations, warning signs, glances between workers, that uneasy feeling when people who know the job start sensing something isn't right. He doesn't rush to the fire. He lets the pressure build first. Then, once everything goes wrong, he goes full throttle. The explosion sequences where his strengths really show. The camera stays right there with the crew, and you feel the confusion, the noise, the heat, the sheer scale of it all. Berg doesn't turn the disaster into polished action fantasy. He makes it dirty, loud, and frightening, and his genuine interest in ordinary people under extreme pressure gives the film real pulse. But his direction has limits too. The same energy that makes the film immersive also makes it hard to follow at times. The camera shakes a bit too much, the edits come a bit too fast, and there are stretches where you're not entirely sure who's where or what just happened. Berg wants chaos and he gets it, maybe more than the film can always fully control. He's also stronger with survival than with reflection. As an action director, he creates real momentum, but as a commentator on the wider social issues, he's more blunt. The film clearly understands that corporate greed is dangerous, but it doesn't dig deeply into the larger consequences. Berg is far more comfortable showing fire, mud, metal, panic, and courage than sitting with the broader environmental or legal aftermath. Still, within the frame he's chosen, he directs with real conviction. Deepwater Horizon isn't quiet or subtle, and it's not trying to be. Berg makes it immediate, muscular, and emotionally direct. At his best, he makes you feel trapped on that rig alongside the workers, watching a preventable disaster spiral out of control. And even when the film gets messy, you can't accuse it of feeling distant. Berg puts you right in the middle of the disaster, sometimes too close, but close enough to make it hurt. A serious approach to tragedy. What's genuinely appreciable about Deepwater Horizon is that, for the most part, it doesn't treat the disaster as cheap entertainment. That would have been the easy route. A giant rig explosion, non-stop fire, people fighting for survival in the middle of the ocean could easily have become pure spectacle. Noise, flames, slow-motion hero shots, and swelling music trying to wring emotion out of every second. Instead, the film takes a more careful approach. There's real seriousness in how Berg handles the material. He takes his time before the explosion, letting us sit with the workers, the machinery, the routine of the place, so the film never feels impatient to blow everything up. It wants us to understand that this was a real workplace before it became a disaster site. That matters, because when the explosion finally arrives, the film doesn't feel like it's celebrating the destruction, that feels horrified by it. The fire is massive, the effects are intense, the action is loud, but there's always an unpleasant weight underneath it all. These aren't fictional bodies being tossed around for entertainment. They're based on real workers caught in something that never should have happened. The film has an almost docudrama quality at points, saying not fully documentary-like, since it's still very much a Hollywood disaster film, but there's enough procedural detail and workplace texture to make the world feel grounded. You see people doing their jobs, arguing over safety, checking systems, trying to make sense of the readings. The film respects the fact that this disaster came from a chain of decisions, not a single dramatic moment, and even when the intensity ramps up, it usually avoids feeling tasteless. It doesn't turn the tragedy into a victory lap. The ending, in particular, refocuses on loss, shock, and the people who didn't make it home, giving the film a sincere sense of tribute. Is the film completely free of Hollywood polish? No, it still relies on familiar emotional tools, family scenes, heroic framing, music swelling at the right beats. But compared to what this could have been, Deepwater Horizon shows real restraint. It wants to grip you, absolutely, but it also wants you to remember that this actually happened, and that difference keeps it from feeling like disaster tourism. Visual effects that feel physical. One of the first things that strikes you once the disaster unfolds is just how effective the visuals are. The blend of CGI and practical effects creates something massive, terrifying, and most importantly believable. The rig never feels like a floating toy on a green screen. You feel its weight, the way fire spreads, the way mud and smoke move through the corridors. It's big, industrial, and dangerous. And the effects sell every bit of that. Berg doesn't lean on flashy CGI tricks for their own sake. The computer-generated work mostly enhances what's already happening practically on set. A raging firestorm, explosions that feel like they could bring the ceiling down, mud and debris flying through the air. It's messy, chaotic, and realistic, which is exactly what makes the sequence so terrifying. You can almost feel the heat on your skin. It's not just the destruction itself, either. The visuals help tell the survival story too, through smoke-filled corridors, flames chewing through metal, and lifeboats swinging in the chaos. You can follow the crew, at least most of the time, and the environment itself becomes almost a character, constantly shifting, unpredictable, deadly, which makes every decision the crew makes feel genuinely urgent. The effects aren't flawless. In the thick of the explosions and mud, it can be hard to tell exactly who's where, adding to the disorientation, but that might be intentional, since a real disaster wouldn't be clear or easy to follow either. The confusion feeds the immersion, even if it occasionally has you squinting at the screen. Overall, the visual effects strike a good balance, big, messy, and intense, but never stealing focus from the story. Instead, they serve it, making the disaster feel immediate, physical, and frighteningly real. This is genuinely one of the areas where the film earns its intensity. Sound design that builds dread. The sound in Deepwater Horizon does far more than simply make the explosions louder, and honestly, this might be the film's strongest technical achievement. The story is built around pressure, and the sound design makes you feel that pressure long before you fully understand what's happening. Machines hum, metal groans, alarms sit quietly in the background, voices overlap in the control room. There's always something mechanical happening somewhere, as if the rig itself is breathing. Then, once the disaster hits, the sound turns brutal. The explosions don't feel clean, they feel heavy, like something massive tearing open. Fire roars across the platform, alarms scream over one another, steel bends and snaps, people shout through smoke and chaos, and every blast seems to shake the entire film. It's not noise for its own sake. It creates genuine panic and makes the space feel dangerous. You can understand why the film earned attention in the technical categories, because the sound design is doing real emotional work. It keeps you tense, makes the rig feel alive before the explosion and wounded afterward. There are moments where dialogue barely matters, because the environment tells you everything and the machinery is failing, the situation is slipping away, and no one is in control anymore. The score, meanwhile, is more restrained than you might expect. It doesn't constantly try to force emotion that sits underneath the dread and arises when the film genuinely needs the push. There are moments, especially the more sentimental ones, where it leans into familiar disaster movie feeling, but for the most part it knows when to stay behind the fire, the alarms, and the human panic. That restraint matters, because a film like this could easily become overscored. Too much music risks making the tragedy feel polished, even heroic in the wrong way. Deepwater Horizon works best when the soundscape feels raw, when the machinery, the blasts, and the silence after impact carry the scene. Those quieter moments matter just as much. After so much noise, a sudden drop can hit harder than another explosion, a pause, a breath, a survivor trying to process what just happened. That's where the film reminds you this isn't just spectacle, it's trauma. The visuals are impressive, but the sound is what really traps you on that rig. Out, harsh, messy, and terrifying, exactly as it should be. Cinematography and production design. The way Deepwater Horizon is shot plays a huge role in why it feels so intense. The cinematography sells the sheer scale of the rig. Wide shots capture just how massive the platform is, while close, almost claustrophobic angles put you inside corridors filled with smoke, mud, and fire. That balance matters. You see the enormity of the disaster while still feeling the individual human stakes. Editing plays a major role too. Berg moves quickly between different parts of the rig, the crew trying to escape, the BP executives making bad calls, people onshore waiting for news. It's fast, occasionally chaotic, and you can lose your footing here and there, but that's largely the point. You're not meant to have a perfect mental map of the disaster, you're meant to feel it. The confusion, the panic, the unpredictability. Then there's the production design. The rig genuinely feels lived in. You notice small details in the equipment, the control panels, the toolboxes, the way the crew moves through their spaces. It's messy, industrial, and convincing. And it makes the workplace believable, which in turn makes the disaster sequence hit harder. You're not just watching CGI fire on a soundstage. You're watching a fully realized workplace get torn apart. There are moments where it all becomes a bit overwhelming. So much smoke, fire, and running that it's hard to track exactly who's where. But again, that reinforces the immersion, since real disasters are genuinely chaotic and the camera and editing don't try to sanitize that. Taken together, the visuals, editing, rhythm, and set design make the rig feel tangible, massive, and dangerous. You're not just watching a movie about an explosion. You're inside it, and that's exactly what a film like this needs to make you care. The emotional core, what really lingers after Deepwater Horizon, isn't the explosions or the fire. It's the emotional weight underneath all that chaos. The film never lets you forget these aren't fictional characters, they were real people doing real work, and some of them didn't come home. That knowledge seeps into every scene, even during the lighter moments. Joking around, checking gauges, moving through routine. There's an undercurrent of tension, an awareness that the danger is real, which charges every small interaction, a glance, a raised eyebrow, a hurried check, with extra weight. Once the disaster hits, the intensity ramps up, and yes, there's some melodrama. Swelling music, emphasized family connections, faces contorting in fear and pain, but it generally works because it's grounded in real stakes. We've already invested in these people, seen their routines, watched them care for one another. So when the rig burns and people fight for survival, it lands hard. This isn't a subtle film, and it isn't pretending to be. It wants you to feel the panic, the heroism, the fear, and the grief all at once. Some scenes are almost too calculated in their emotional targeting. You can feel the film nudging you towards sadness or suspense, but because the underlying events are so horrifying, that nudge feels earned rather than manipulative. Much of the emotional core comes from the human relationships. Mike fighting to survive for his family, Jimmy fighting to save his crew, workers looking out for one another. These connections make the disaster personal, transforming the explosions from spectacle into genuine tragedy. By the end, the film doesn't just leave you with a visual memory of fire and smoke, it leaves you with a feeling, a mix of heartbreak, respect, and frustration that lingers well after the credits roll. In a story about a preventable disaster, that lasting emotional impact matters just as much as any visual effect. Honoring the 11. One of the most powerful things Deepwater Horizon does is honor the 11 men who lost their lives. This is never just a disaster movie spectacle. Even amid the explosions and chaos, Berg makes clear these were real people. We get glimpses of their personalities and routines, the way they interact with co-workers, and once the rig starts breaking apart, the stakes become heartbreakingly real. These aren't faceless extras, they're human beings with families, hopes, and lives cut tragically short. The film doesn't dwell on them excessively, but it makes sure you feel the weight of their absence. As the fire rages and people scramble for survival, there's an underlying awareness that some of these men won't make it, and that tension gives every close call and every act of heroism extra emotional force. Even in quieter moments, the film reminds you these deaths mattered. The crew's camaraderie before the disaster, the personal stakes, the reactions of families waiting on shore, all of it reinforces how personal this tragedy really was. By the end, the tribute feels earned. The closing moments, the way the disaster is framed, and the subtle acknowledgments of the victims all make clear that this film means to remember and honor the people behind the headlines, a reminder that the fire, mud, and explosions aren't just thrilling visuals but a reflection of real lives lost, giving the film emotional weight that lingers long after the screen fades to black. The aftermath, trauma that doesn't end with the fire. One thing Deepwater Horizon doesn't shy away from is showing that surviving the rig doesn't mean the nightmare is over. After the explosions, fire, mud, and chaos, the survivors are alive but shaken, exhausted, and haunted. And the film lets that sink in. You see them coughing, covered in grime, looking around in disbelief. They physically escaped, but emotionally crushed by the weight of what just happened. Berg doesn't linger on therapy sessions or overwrought speeches, but he offers small moments that say a great deal. A glance toward a friend who didn't make it, a pause as a worker registers just how close he came to death, the quiet aftermath as everyone tries to process what they've been through. Those small details make the trauma feel authentic, a reminder that survival comes with its own cost, that these men didn't walk away unscathed. The fire and destruction were only the beginning. What stays with them afterward is fear, guilt, and shock, feelings that don't simply disappear once you leave the rig behind. That focus on survivor trauma humanizes the disaster further. It's no longer just about fire and explosions, but about people carrying the memory of those who didn't make it, and about the fact that even the lucky ones carry lasting emotional scars. In a way, those quieter, more painful moments after the chaos are just as powerful as the action itself. They remind you why the story matters, because the tragedy doesn't end with the flames. It lives on in the people who were there, and Berg never lets us forget that. What the film leaves out, one of the bigger criticisms leveled at Deepwater Horizon, is what it chooses not to show. The environmental disaster itself. The explosion and fire dominate the screen, and the human tragedy is front and center. But the oil spill's long-term damage to the Gulf of Mexico and the wildlife, the coastline, the ripple effects is barely touched. There's an oil-stained bird here, a brief nod there suggesting the spill is happening beyond the rig. But the film stays overwhelmingly focused on the people on board. That's a deliberate choice, and it's understandable given the story is primarily about the rig crew's fight to survive. But it does leave you wanting more context. This wasn't just a workplace tragedy, it was one of the worst ecological disasters in American history. Millions of gallons of oil spread through the Gulf, affecting marine life, fishing communities, and coastlines for years afterward. The film gestures toward that reality without ever fully digging into it, as if the human story was simply easier to dramatize. Fire, smoke, explosions, and heroism are cinematic. The slower, messier environmental aftermath is harder to visualize and dramatize, even though it's no less real or important. So while Deepwater Horizon nails the tension, the chaos, and the human heroism, it leaves the lasting scars on the Gulf itself largely unexplored, and a mission that can feel jarring, since you're aware in the back of your mind that the consequences extended far beyond the rig. In other words, the film makes you feel the heat, the fire, the mud, and the loss of life, but it doesn't fully make you feel the oil, and that's a piece of the story that lingers in your head well after the credits roll. Similarly, the film mostly skips over what happened once the flames were extinguished. That's frustrating, because it spends so much time establishing how BP's decisions helped cause the disaster, only to leave that thread largely unexplored in the aftermath. We get the explosion, the survival, the grief, but the legal fallout, the corporate accountability, the public reckoning, all of it gets treated more as background context than as part of the drama. There was arguably a whole other film sitting right there: the courtroom battles, the compensation claims, executives protecting themselves, workers and families searching for answers, corporate statements, blame shifting, and the fight to control the narrative. That material could have added a completely different layer of tension to the story. Box office and recognition: this is a big, expensive, technically ambitious disaster film with a strong cast and a real-life tragedy behind it, backed by some genuinely accomplished filmmaking. You'd expect that combination to translate into an easy hit, but that's not quite what happened. The film had the scale of a major studio release, yet its box office performance came in softer than expected. That's understandable in hindsight. This isn't exactly a light-hearted night-out disaster movie. It has explosions, fire, chaos, and survival tension, sure, but the entire story is tied to a very recent real-world tragedy. People died, the Gulf was damaged, and BP remained strongly linked in the public mind to anger, lawsuits, and environmental devastation. So the film carried blockbuster packaging but genuinely heavy subject matter, which made it a tricky sell. Financially, it was expensive to produce, and while it earned money worldwide, the total didn't quite match the kind of success the studio was presumably hoping for. That underperformance stings a bit for a film with this much technical ambition. The money is clearly visible on screen, in the rig, the fire, the effects, the sound, the sheer scale of destruction. None of it looks cheap, but expensive craftsmanship doesn't automatically guarantee a huge audience, especially with subject matter this uncomfortable. Where the film did get proper recognition was in the technical categories, and that tracks. Whatever you think of the pacing, character depth, or the missing aftermath, the sound and visual effects are difficult to dismiss. The explosions carry real weight, the fire feels genuinely dangerous, and the combination of metal, mud, alarms, smoke, and pressure creates a disaster sequence that feels physical and punishing. That's exactly the kind of work award bodies tend to notice, because it's not merely decorative, it's central to the film's entire experience. The Oscar nominations for its technical work feel earned. This is a film where the craft itself is doing an enormous amount of storytelling. The sound makes the rig feel alive before it becomes a nightmare. The effects make the destruction feel massive without tipping into empty spectacle. The technical side is probably the film's most universally defensible strength. So the awards and the box office tell two different stories. As a business gamble, Deepwater Horizon struggled, but as a piece of technical filmmaking, it made a real impression, and that feels about right for the film as a whole. It's not a perfect movie, and it's not a massive crowd pleaser, but it's a serious, intense, well-crafted disaster drama whose strongest achievements come through in the heat, the noise, and the terrifying scale of the catastrophe it depicts. Final thoughts. What works when Deepwater Horizon works? It really works. Its biggest strength is sheer intensity. Once the disaster begins, the film grabs hold and doesn't give you much room to settle. The fire, the mud, the alarms, the collapsing metal, the panic spreading across the rig. It all feels immediate in a way plenty of disaster films aim for but don't always achieve. You're not watching the chaos from a distance, you're pulled into it, and that's where the technical craft becomes such a major asset. The sound design is brutal in the best sense. Every explosion carries weight, every alarm cuts through the scene, and the rig sounds alive before the disaster and wounded after it. The visual effects are equally strong. Not because they're flashy but because they feel physical. The destruction has texture, the fire feels hot, the mud feels thick, and the whole rig feels like a real place being torn apart rather than a digital playground built for spectacle. The performances ground all of that. Mark Wahlberg gives the film a steady center, believable as an ordinary working man caught in something far bigger than himself. Kurt Russell brings real authority as Jimmy Harrell, and the film feels more solid every time he's on screen. John Malkovich supplies the sharpest tension as Donald Vedrine, playing corporate arrogance with a calm, almost irritating confidence that makes you want to reach through the screen and stop the conversation yourself. Another strength is how well the film builds dread before the explosion. Even when the first half moves slowly, it creates a genuine sense of pressure building beneath the surface, and you know something's wrong. The crew knows something's wrong, and the people who should be listening are too preoccupied with time, money, and schedule delays. That makes the disaster feel less like a random accident and more like the terrible outcome of ignored warnings. The film also treats the real people involved with genuine respect. It doesn't handle the event like cheap entertainment. Yes, it's loud and intense, and yes, it follows the shape of a Hollywood disaster film. But underneath that there's a sincere tribute to the workers who died and the survivors who carried the trauma forward. That emotional respect matters, because the film's greatest strength is understanding that this disaster wasn't just fire on the water or headlines about BP. It was a workplace full of people with families, people trying to do their jobs, people who trusted that safety would matter more than speed. When the film remembers that, it becomes more than a well-made disaster movie. It becomes genuinely affecting. Where it falls short for everything Deepwater Horizon does well, it has its share of rough edges. The pacing is the first issue, and the opening half takes its time, maybe more than it needs to. The reasoning is understandable. The film wants to establish the crew, the rig, the pressure from BP, and the warning signs. But there are stretches where it feels stuck in setup mode, with people discussing tests, schedules, pressure readings, cement, and equipment while the film clearly strives for accuracy. The problem is that accuracy doesn't always translate to gripping drama. That leads into the second issue, the jargon. There's a lot of technical language here, and not all of it lands cleanly. You often understand the emotional shape of a scene. Something's wrong, the crew is worried, BP is pushing too hard, without always understanding the exact mechanics behind why a particular test matters or why one reading is alarming while another isn't. The film gives you enough to feel the tension but not always enough to follow the underlying logic. Once the disaster begins, the problem almost inverts. The slow first half gives way to a frantic second half, and while the chaos is intense, it can be hard to read. Everyone is covered in mud, soot, smoke, blood, and oil. The camera shakes, the editing jumps around, and characters run through dark spaces, making it genuinely difficult at times to tell who's where, who's hurt, and who made it out. That confusion does add realism, but it also blurs some of the human impact. Character development is another weak spot. Mike, Jimmy, and Vedrine are all clearly drawn, but many of the supporting crew members never get enough room to become fully memorable, a trade-off that comes with prioritizing intensity and momentum over a fully fleshed out ensemble, but one that's noticeable all the same.